Throughout the history of language teaching, attempts have been made to make second language learning more like first language learning. Among those who tried to apply natural principles to language classes in the 19th century were a Frenchman called Francis Gouin. He attempted to build a methodology around observation of child language learning. Another person was Elsevier, who used intensive oral interaction in the target language, employing questions as a way of presenting and eliciting language. This method soon became referred to as the natural method, or direct method. Servieux and other believers in the natural method argue that a foreign language could be taught without translation or the use of the learner's native tongue if meaning was conveyed directly through demonstration and action. Then, Frank wrote on the physiological principles, a direct association between forms and meanings in the target language, and provided a theoretical justification for a monolingual approach to teaching. According to him, a language could best be taught by using it actively in the classroom. Rather than using analytical procedures that focus on explanation of grammar rules in the classroom teaching, teachers must encourage direct and spontaneous use of the foreign language in the classroom. Then, learners will be able to introduce rules of grammar. Also, speaking began with a systematic attention to pronunciation, and known words could be used to teach new vocabulary, using mime, demonstration, and pictures. Enthusiastic supporters of the direct method introduced it in France and Germany, and it became widely known in the United States through its use by Servieux and Maximilian Berlitz in a successful commercial language schools.
Now I'm going to talk about the characteristics of direct methods. Well, teachers intend that students learn how to communicate in the target language, in this case English. Classroom instructions are conducted exclusively in the target language. Only everyday vocabulary and sentences are taught during the initial phase. Grammar, reading, and writing are introduced in the intermediate phase. Grammar is taught inductively, for example, having learners find out rules through the presentation of adequate linguistic forms in the target language. There might never be an explicit grammar rule given. Concrete vocabulary is taught through demonstration, objects, and pictures. Abstract vocabulary is taught by association of ideas. Speech and listening comprehension are taught. Pronunciation is emphasized. Students should be speaking at least 80% of the time during the lesson. Language is primarily spoken, not written. Classroom activities are carried out only in the target language. Use of chain activities accompanied by verbal comments like I go to the door, I open the door, I close the door, I return to my place as I sit down, and so on. Oral communication skills are built up in a carefully graded progression organized around question and answer exchanges between teachers and students in a small or intensive classes. This method helps the students to think in English.
It incorporates a new orientation in language teaching by giving top priority to oral language and advocating teaching in the target language. It is based on the following principles. Exclusive use of the target language. Teaching vocabulary and structures for everyday use. Inductive grammar teaching. Development of oral communication skills progressively and gradually through the exchange of questions and answers between teachers and students. Oral introduction of the new teaching content. Use of the demonstration of objects and pictures in the introduction of concrete vocabulary and of the association of ideas in the introduction of abstract vocabulary. teaching of speaking and listening, and emphasis on pronunciation and grammar.
Now we talk about the theory of language in the direct method. This method isn't based on an explicit linguistic theory, but is based on the idea that language is a communication tool used in concrete situations every day. The language is learned by exposure to it, since structures, sounds, and words are assimilated little by little. For this reason, the oral is privileged over the written. Also, the usefulness of explicit grammatical explanation is underestimated and the translation is censored. Learning is inductive and the prototype of the language is the informal oral language. Stephen Krashen and Tracy Terrell developed the natural approach in the early 80s in 1983, based on Krashen's 5 theories on second language acquisition. He says that acquisition requires meaningful interaction in the target language, natural communication, in which speakers are concerned not with the form of the utterance, but with the message they are conveying and understanding. This acquisition-focused approach sees communicative competence progressing through 3 stages: oral comprehension, early speech production, and speech activities, all fostering natural language acquisition, much as a child will learn his or her native tongue. Following an initial silent period, comprehension should precede production in speech, as the latter should be allowed to emerge in natural stage or progressions. Based on these 5 hypotheses, Krashen and Terrell formulated a proposal for work in classroom called the natural approach. The appeal of Krashen's views and his unquestionable charisma in spreading them made them have a powerful influence in the classroom. These are the 5 hypotheses of Stephen Krashen that are the acquisition learner theory, monitor hypothesis, natural order hypothesis, input hypothesis, and finally affective filter hypothesis. Now in this part we talk about the functional model. This term functional applied to language is derived from the systemic functional theory of Michael Holliday. It's a current theory of language development. It continues to be modified and developed both by Holliday himself and by others, including Rukia, Hassan, and Jim Martin. They believes that the social semantic of language is a system of signs which is used for social purpose. So language is a social process according to them. What assumptions does a functional approach make? Well, language is a social process. Any text, spoken or written, serves a social function or has a social component. Even when we talk or write for yourselves alone, we are using language in ways shaped by your interaction with others. So language is at the center of your construction of reality and your own identity. And it is your chief means of communicating with others in learning to make meaning through language. We also learn to become members of a particular cultural group. So, a functional model uses the concepts of feel, tenor, and mood to describe how a text makes meaning within the context of a particular situation. These are the 3 filters of the situation which influence the way language is used in the text. They have their counterparts in 3 verb functions of language which are reflected in the choices from the language system that can be seen in any text. These verb functions are called the ideational the interpersonal and textual metafunctions. So in the field, we can see what is the text is about, and the function of language here is the ideational metafunction. In the tenor, we can see the relationship between speaker and writer and the listener and reader. So it's the interpersonal metafunction. And in the mode, we can see how the text is constructed. So it's the function of language is textual metafunction. And what are the implications for teachers here in this functional model? A particular way of speaking will not be judged bad or good just because it does not conform to standard Australian English, for example. Rather, it may be seen as perfectly appropriate when used in a particular context. So teachers who adapt a functional model of language will value the different ways of talking and different orientations to language and literacy that the students from a whole range of backgrounds bring to the classroom. Teachers need to develop a special language for talking about language, what is sometimes called a meta-language, and is mentioned earlier, they will take time. It is clear that students too need to develop an ability to talk about language form, an understanding of authors of different text types and how they are realized through their grammatical structures will enable teachers to talk in a direct way with students about their reading. So they will be able to demonstrate, for example, a fact report about dinosaurs, and needs to be organized differently from an account about the film Jurassic Park or an imaginary story about the life or in a prehistoric era. So in a particular however, it is important for students to recognize that slang is not appropriate in formal spoken or written context. This is one aspect of learning how to use confidently the kinds of text that carry more power in your society, which is something all students must be enabled to do. Also, in this method, we can see another theory of language, that is interactional model. In the interactional model, we can see this theory that consists that the language development is a compromise between the native theory and the behaviorist theory of language development. The interaction theory recognizes that both environment and biological factors are important in language development. So within this theory of compromise are theorists who are closer to one end of the extreme than the other. However, all interactionists believe that language acquisition occurs as a result of the natural interaction between children and their environment, more especially their parents or caregivers. So Vygotsky believed that children develop through thought and language, and all the interactionalists believe that the language is a product of children's social interactions with the important people in their lives. So here, teachers can present elements of interactional language and raise learners' awareness of interactional strategies by exposure to video and authentic conversation. Learners can learn to use paralinguistic features such as gestures, eye contact, and body language, and linguistic features used to maintain an interactional conversation, including functions such as expressing interest and asking for clarification. So the interactionist approach, or the sociocultural theory, combines ideas from sociology and biology to explain how language is developed. And according to this theory, children learn language out of a desire to communicate with the world around them. So language emerges from, and it depends upon social interaction. So the interactionist approach claims that If your language ability develops out of a desire to communicate, then language is depends upon warm example can be when infants being raised by only their mother are more likely to learn the word mom and less likely to develop that, for example. Among the first words we learn are ways to demand attention or food. If you ever try to learn a new language, you may recognize these theories' influence. Language classes often teach commonly used vocabulary and phrases first, and then focus on building conversations rather than simple rote memorization. Even when we expand your vocabularies in your native language, we remember the words we use the most. So that's the most important in this part of interactionist approach and in this theory of language. In this method, it's really important to know the functional model and interactionist model.
Language learning theory. Gratian's monitor. Gratian says that we learn a second language in the same way that we acquire the first language. The teacher functions as a monitor that checks and repairs the output. According to Gratian, the role of the monitor is minor, being used only to correct deviation from normal speech and to give speech a more polished appearance. In this language learning theory, the native language shouldn't be used in the classroom. A lot of vocabulary should be exposed to the student. A lot of activities should be developed. And this theory is not based in grammar. It is based on communication. The monitor acts in planning, editing, and correcting function.
The main objective of the direct method is to provide learners with a practically useful knowledge of language.
In this method, the syllabus is developed by topic-based learning or functional scenarios. It is based on situations or topics, and linguistic structures are usually not used. For example, the syllabus might suggest that all the lessons of the week involve the American culture.
In this method, the teacher and the student are more like partners in the learning process. The role of the teacher is to direct the class activities, encourage students to participate in class, and correct their mistakes immediately. The teacher introduces new words or phrases in the target language, but he or she never translates, so there is no use of the mother tongue. That's the reason why the role of the teacher is a demonstrator, because he or she demonstrates the meaning of words through the use of realia, pictures, or pantomime. Moreover, the teachers are the students' resource since they provide information of the target language about cultural and native people. Finally, the teachers has the students self-correct by asking them to make a choice between what they said and an alternative answer supplied, or repeat what the student said but stopping just before the error. The student's role in direct method is the active learner. They are active in exploring new words, expressions, and so on in the target language. The students are also the observed and the practitioner. They observe the target language used by the teacher and they try to get the meaning based on the given demonstration.
Role of materials. The primary goal of materials to present content, to practice content, to facilitate communication between learners. The form materials take textbooks, computers. The relation of materials to other sources of input. Also, the abilities of the teachers, their competence in the language or degree of training and experience. And finally, materials generally serve as the basis for much of the language input learners receive and the language practice that occurs in the classroom.
In the evaluation, students are asked to use the language instead of demonstrating their knowledge about the language. In other words, teachers just want to see students' speaking and writing skills. For instance, the evaluation can be accomplished if the teacher interviews with students or asks them to write something about what they studied.
Here are some techniques that are commonly used in the direct method, that are dialogues, reading aloud, students' self-correction, association to the concept and target language, facial gestures, dictation for greeting ability. So we can notice that teacher, employing various techniques, tries to get the students to self-correct whenever possible. So one of the examples can be when students read aloud a passage about the geography of the United States. So the teacher points to a part of the map after each sentence is read by each student or all students at the same time. The teacher used the target language to ask the students if they have questions. Students ask questions about the map. The teacher works with the students on the pronunciation of Appalachian. That's one really good example about how they improve their pronunciation with the help of the teacher and the interaction between both. The teacher corrects grammar error by asking the students to make a choice. That's a really useful technique to correct the grammar interactively. The teacher asks questions about the students. Students ask each other questions. The students fill in blanks with proposition practice in the lesson. The teacher dictates a paragraph about the United States geography. All of the lessons of the week involve United States geography. A proverb is used to discuss how Americans view punctuality. So in this example, we can notice that the teacher introduced all parts of the direct method. For example, the culture section. It's really important to the students know about the target language and reach the goals about communicative competence here, because the sociolinguistic is here presented, because they must to learn about the culture. The interaction is very important in the classroom in this part, and also the association between the concept and the word, how it's grading. The dictation is really important, the reading also. So here it's a really good example about a class applying the direct method.
The advantages of this method are: the student's role is more active, the culture of the community speaking the target language is taught, the 4 skills are developed, oral practice and pronunciation are emphasized. The direct method has offered important innovations in the field of teaching processes. It has made visible the problems that exist in teaching and in the learning process, and opens the way towards the didactics of foreign languages, and downplays the study of traditional grammar through reading and writing. The disadvantages are: its proposals have been difficult to apply in large groups or in public schools. The requirement not to use the mother tongue often leads to complicated explanations in the target language. The teacher must spend too much time explaining a term that would have required a brief explanation if the student's mother tongue had been used, and often the teacher doesn't achieve their goal. The detractors of the direct method argue that their approaches lack a theoretical and methodological basis, since the method doesn't have a theory about the nature of the language or a theory about the learning of it. Nor does it have consistent methodological principles that serve as a basis for teaching techniques. Its proposals have been difficult to apply in large groups or in public schools, and his demands not to use the mother tongue has often resulted in cumbersome and complicated explanations in the target language. Despite all these drawbacks, the direct method offered important innovations in the field of teaching processes, has made visible the problem that exists in teaching and in the learning process, and has opened the way towards the didactics of foreign languages.